Well, howdy, folks. Welcome to the July edition of Cattle Trails Showcase. I'm Ron Wilson, Poet Laureate. Mighty glad to be your host. Today is a different day and different time than our typical monthly Cattle Trail Showcases have taken place. And so I thank everyone who's joining us. I'm sorry for any confusion on times or dates. We are glad you're with us or viewing this on YouTube. The purpose of the Cattle Trails Showcase is to continually highlight the communities, historical elements, museums, and other attractions along the historic cattle trails. Showcase is brought to you by the International Chisholm Trail Association, of which Dennis Katzenmeyer is president, Michael Brower is vice president, Nancy Lawrence is secretary, and Mary Lou Rivers is treasurer. And Lonnie Steben, who's with us, is our showcase chair. Each month, we are doing these Cattle Trails Showcases, and I might note that next month, we will have a special edition of Cattle Trails Showcase back to our usual time on the second Friday of each month. But many of you know of the work of Doug Harmon, who was one of the founders of the International Chisholm Trail Association. He has graciously donated much of his huge memorabilia, Western history items that he's donated to the Chisholm Trail Museum in Cleburne. Cleburne is the outdoor museum that we've seen before, and it's being enhanced now with the collection of items from Doug Harmon. Carrie, if you want to unmute and say a couple of words about that, you're welcome.
Thank you. We are so excited to have this collection here. You know, we presented to Doug back in 2020, and it took us this long to get the facility, the building done. And we unveiled it here just a few weeks ago, and it is phenomenal. It is like the frosting on the cake out here at our museum. And so he's got stuff that I could never imagine. When we went to his house, I'll tell you, you know, the U-Haul box trucks that you have to rent, 6 of those. Oh, and we didn't even get all of his stuff, but the museum is packed. It's beautiful, and people are coming specifically just to see his collection. So we're honored to have it.
Well, we're thrilled to hear about that. We look forward to hearing more about it next month on our Cattle Trails Showcase, and so glad that his memorabilia has found a home there in Cleburne. On this program, we've talked a lot about the Chisholm Trail and the Western Trail, but there were predecessor cattle trails even before those. And that's part of the subject of tonight's program. Anyone who grew up watching Rawhide, like I did, know that the destination of those cattle drives was Sedalia, Missouri. And today we're zooming to Sedalia to learn about the beautiful Starline brass Trails In Monument and the other elements that are part of the attractions there. So Doug, is it Kiburz?
Kiburz.
Kiburz. Doug Kiburz is chair of the committee there, and we welcome Doug. And please share with us, tell us about the Trails In Monument.
Happy to, Ron. Thank you very much for the opportunity to share a Missouri perspective on cattle trails, the Western expansion, and the historical perspective of the West. This is, if you came into today, about what you'd see in 1860 come into town. This is the Starline Brass Trails In Plaza. And it was Dale and Liz Yelton had the thought about 10 years ago that, well, we have a lot of important Western history. In fact, we're the end of the Shawnee Sedalia Trail. Maybe we should have some kind of commemoration. So hoteliers, teachers, artists, landscapers, lawyers, physicians, machinists, tired people, retired people got together to make this dream a reality. And so that is what you'd be seeing. It was about $1 million project raised by all public funds, primarily funded by the Hayden family and Starline Brass. And if you're not familiar with Sedalia, we are about an hour from Kansas City, about 3 hours from St. Louis. We've had a lot of monikers over time. George R. Smith was the founder in 1860, named it for his daughter Sed. and they were going to call it Sedville, but that was not cosmopolitan enough, so it became Sedalia. And as people were heading west with their wagons, it became the Queen City of the Prairie for stopover and resupply. As Ron mentioned, at the first cattle drive at the end of the Civil War, they were driving from Texas to get up to the end of the railroad, which at the time was Sedalia. So we are the trail's end town. Well, you can imagine with all of those cowboys and all those railroad men, we had over 100 houses of negotiated affection at one time. So we were also called the Sodom and Gomorrah of the Midwest. At the turn of the century, that would be 2 turn of the centuries ago, the state fair came here. So we have been State Fair City. That same George R. Smith started one of the first black colleges in America, and a young man from Texarkana came up to study music. And he made a little extra money playing down at the Maple Leaf Saloon and Brothel. And he started pounding out some syncopated rhythms, and that was the cradle of ragtime music. His name was Scott Joplin, and it is the cradle of ragtime music starting here. Then when the train moved on after the war, the MKT, the Katy, and the Missouri Pacific both had their shops here. There were more trains repaired here than any place west of the Mississippi. So at one point, Union Pacific declared us Train Town, USA. And one last little moniker, our city thinks it's important to maintain an urban forest. We work hard to our tree preservation. So the Arbor Day called us a Tree City, USA. Despite all of the Sodom and Gomorrah things, there's a little culture here as well. We're somewhat known as the regional mecca for the arts because of music, arts, one of the first Carnegie libraries west of the Mississippi, theater, the second oldest continually performing symphony west of the Mississippi, and as an example, one of the best contemporary art museums in the country, the Dom Museum. So a little pictorial review of when the prairie schooners were coming through. Rawhide started in 1959, and you'll recognize some of those characters. It ran for 8 years, all those years on the way to Sedalia. Scott Joplin on the piano, the train history, the Tree City, USA. The Wright brothers came to our state fair in 1910 with their plane flying over the Missouri State Fair. And because of the bustling early history, we have a lot of structures on the National Historic Landmark. One on the bottom left is the Katy Depot. Andrew Carnegie came over from Scotland because of his oil and railroad and steel. He made quite a sum, but he left a good foundation as well. He started a library in his native Scotland, but built over 2,500 libraries around the world. One of the first west of the Mississippi was the Carnegie Library here, which is still the Sedalia Public Library. Probably the best place to start is at the beginning. Thomas Jefferson and the Louisiana Purchase from France sent Meriwether Lewis and William Clark in the Corps of Discovery. They had Seaman, the Newfoundland dog. They picked up Sacagawea along the way to find a route to the west. They left in 1803. They came back in 1806. Now, it was unknown Indian territory. They went 8,000 miles, truly one of the greatest adventures in American history. But when they came back within 15 years from unknown Indian territory, we were a state. So that shows you how dynamic the West was during those times. Following those years of the pre-Civil War era, Missouri was a conflicted state. During the war, we had the third most skirmishes in the Civil War. We had generals on the north, generals on the south, supplies going north, supplies going south. The Missouri State Star was on the Confederate flag and on the Union flag. Even in little old Sedalia, there were both Confederate and Union troops. During that time, 1862, Lincoln had signed the Homestead Act and the Railroad Act to encourage people to move to the west. The Missouri Pacific was on its way from St. Louis, but when the war broke out, you could not build a railroad, so the train stopped dead in its tracks here in Sedalia. Well, after the war, 1866, there were millions of cattle in Texas worth about $4. worth about $40 up in the northern market. So the cattle barons said, we have to get our cattle up north. And the only way to do that was to round them up and drive them to the end of the railroad, which at the time was Sedalia. Now, it turns out there was one literate cowboy, George Duffield, and he kept a journal. And that journal became the basis of what would be the 8 years of Rawhide. And that started the golden age of the American cowboy. During that time, somewhere from 12 to 27 million head of livestock headed up north, which is the greatest animal migration in history. Now, when the train moved on, so did the trails. After the Sedalia, Shawnee Trail, onto the Chisholm Trail, the Western Trail, and eventually the Goodnight Loving Trail. And as you all know, they rounded up 2,000 or 3,000 head of longhorns running wild over the Texas plains. They had the roundup, put a road brand on, found a bell or lead steer to lead the way, and they rounded up a crew, which could be cavalrymen left over, freed slaves, vaqueros, the Mexican cowboys. Of course, the cowboys taught most of the Americans the ropes as far as the cattle moving up north. There were some women, mainly disguised as men, who were on the trail drives. There were boys they called cowboys because most of the men were dead in Texas. So these were young teenagers that they called cowboys. There was also Native Americans on the crew. The remuda was all the horses, and there was at least 6 horses per cowboy. Some horses were better at, wrangling. Some were better at river crossing. Some were better at the night herd. But they couldn't own their own horse, because if you got tired of all the fun on the trail, you couldn't just get on your own horse and ride off, because if you took a remuda horse, you were a horse thief and you could get hung. So that was a pretty good motivation to stay to the end of the drive. It's been said the cowboys had 2 meals in the dark, one before sunup, one after sunset. They could make 10 to 20 miles a day, not too fast, not too slow. Too fast and they lost weight, too slow and they'd run out of grass before the destination. And Charles Goodnight came along with a chuck wagon, so if your group was lucky, you had a good chuck wagon. And other than the trail boss, the most important man on the drive was Cookie, to make sure the men were well fed. And those cowboys had all kinds of fun and excitement. They had Indian attacks, rustler attacks, Civil War renegades, lightning killed many, cholera, anthrax, stampedes. A cow can go about 25 miles an hour when he's motivated, so that's like getting hit by a linebacker. They had flooded rivers. Of course, most of the cowboys could not swim. Rattlesnakes, horse mishaps. And if you're around horses, you know it's not if but when something's going to happen. And even homesteaders, early homesteaders, didn't want these drovers coming across their land. For all that fun, cowboys got about $1 a day, maybe $100 for the trip. Took 10 or 15 cowboys for the whole crew, but the trail boss had to figure he was going to lose about 20% of those to death and disfigurement. So you had to figure that into the equation. They had their denim jeans, their broad rim hats, chaps, bandana, and the Colt 45. Nighttime, they could break the boredom by the cows and the camp, singing some songs, telling some stories, doing some poems. Of course, most of the time they didn't write them down and weren't that literate, so when they went from camp to camp, those stories and songs might have some different versions along the way. It was the time of the American cowboy. The railroads moved west, and it was a great time in American history. Then came Joseph Glidden. He came along with Barb, that they called Thorny Wire, back in 1874. Steel-bladed plow was plowing up the prairies. Windmills made it possible for ranches to go out most anywhere, not just be by a spring or be by a river. Epidemiology had an impact, particularly Texas fever, the parasite that brought some fever up to the cattle that weren't used to it up in the north. But the American cowboy came to be known for hard work, perseverance, adaptability, loyalty, dependability, a can-do attitude, self-reliance, and strength. Had to throw in here one of my heroes, Baxter Black, while I was at it, because even today, in the small screen and the large screen, the history of the cowboy is well documented. This is just a little sidestep. When the men out west from Tennessee and Kentucky had their coonskin caps, they weren't all that practical. Back in 1830, a family in New Jersey had a son that contracted tuberculosis, and doctor told him he didn't have long to live. He was a short timer. Now in New York, Horace Greeley was telling people, go west, young man, go west and grow up with the country. Well, he thought he'd see some of that before he passed on. So he took off, went to Illinois, spent some time in Missouri. Gold rush came. He went out to the Pikes Peak area in Colorado. Turned out the altitude pretty much cured his tuberculosis. He was making some tents and looking around at these hats these men were wearing. And he thought what they needed was something you could water yourself, water your horse. You could use for a tent, sleeping, taking a nap. You could fan a fire. You could move a cow. You could signal. Kept out the sun, kept out the rain and wind. And he made a hat with a little bit of a dome and a big rim on it. And that was pretty handy. In fact, a fellow came along and gave him $5 for that hat. Well, eventually he made his way back to Philadelphia, started a hat factory, and his name was Stetson. John Batterson Stetson is kind of the story of his life and part of the Western history. I did promise a virtual tour of Trails End and start off with the locomotive. People said, boy, your train looks mighty small. Well, the trains were small back then. And trains are identified by their wheel configuration. There's 3 numbers. The first number is the drive wheels or the front wheels, then the driving wheels in back, and then the back wheels. So this is a 440, which was pretty standard back in the time. You can tell that it burned wood because it's got that big funnel stack. When you burn wood, you had cinders that would start prairie fires. And so when the big funnel, it is a cinder catcher. Now the coal burning trains had a straight stack on those, so that differentiates those. But people hadn't figured out yet that coal burned twice the BTU that wood did. Of course, back then you could only go 10, 20 miles. You'd have to have a wooden whistle stop or wooden water stop, so trains wouldn't go very far. Of course, the bank robbers or the train robbers, they knew where the train was going, about when it was going. Jesse James jumped a train just outside of Sedalia during his reign of terror. As you come to the Trails End Plaza, there's an educational kiosk, and this particular structure is the same on every time you see on the Katy Trail from St. Louis all the way to Kansas City. This is the same structure. You'll see at every trailhead. And being an educational kiosk, it should have some important information, such as the longest rail-to-trail conversion in the country is the Katy Trail, which is a linear park that goes pretty much the length of the state, 240 miles. It is now linked up with the Rock Island line, which parallels it and makes a turn, crosses over at Windsor and goes up to Kansas City. The Katy is part of the American Discovery Trail, so you can jump on the trail and go to the East Coast or the West Coast. Last year, activity on the Katy Trail brought $30 million to the state of Missouri. A tribute to the Native Americans, there is a map. It has a map of all the traditional names and locations of the Indian tribes in North America. There are over 500 tribes that are registered in America. The next one is a hand-drawn map of Pettis County, where Sedalia is. And it goes back to the time of the dinosaurs. On the upper left, on the header, you'll see a mule, because Missouri has become famous for mules. Partly it is our state animal. And in the Civil War, the First World War, and the Second World War, mules were essential for the war effort in moving men and machinery. Not quite as big as Andrew Carnegie, but we do have a free little library. It's got an interesting history. In 2009, Todd Bowl put up what looked like a little schoolhouse on a post and put books in it to honor his mother, who was a school teacher. Well, that seemed to be a pretty good idea, and so somebody put another one up in that town, up in Wisconsin, and then moved out of the county and then across state line. So now there are over 150,000 free little libraries in over 120 countries around the world. You'll see these everywhere. And what I always say is people that read live 1,000 lives, people that don't read only one. And their motto is take a book and share a book. Ours is number 105,000. And so it's just a great idea that has rippled around the world. As you take a step closer to the Trails End Plaza, you'll find the audio tour. So it is a free phone number, 660-202-1156. Leroy Van Dyke, a country music Hall of Famer, will answer the phone and give you an overview of the entire project. And then you can go to a number of different stops, which is a 4 or 5 minute dissertation on a number of things you might want to hear about, such as railroad history, the steam locomotive, the drover's caboose. If you dial number 9, you will hear the horse answering the phone and tell you what it's like to be a horse on the cattle drive. If you dial number 10, the cow dog will answer the phone, tell you what it's like to be a cow dog. And so all these things, and you can be riding around or walking around the Trails End Plaza listening, or you can be driving your car in Montana, and it's a free call to listen to these little vignettes on Western history. Next thing you get to is the end of the trail. It's a dedication to the cowboys, pioneers, railroad workers, settlers, and homesteaders whose lives came to an untimely end. They came to settle the Wild West and to forge a better life and future for themselves, future generations. Turns out we are those future generations. There's also a time capsule. It's a leapfrog time capsule, so it'll be opened in 50 years and 100 years. We figured in 50 years, some of our kids that saw this go up will still be alive. And in 100 years is pretty standard to open a time capsule. The bottom right is a pretty standard view of what you might see anywhere in the West. The average person lived to be about 40. Some lived to a ripe old age. 1 in 7 women died in childbirth. 1 in 4 children died before they saw their first birthday. So picture, if you will, some men holding their hats in their cleanest shirts they could find, standing by a recent burial. When I say that we're here at an old pal's funeral, not many people have come, just a few of the boys from the outfit, so he don't go out like a bum. Seems like I've known him forever as we look back over the years. We've rode several wagons together and drank a number of beers. Well, he was good with a rope and a rifle. He was never early or late. In the wagon, he rode in the middle, so he'd never open a gate. Conversing with him was plumb easy, though he never had too much to say. No matter what question you asked him, the answer was always, okay. Well, we've lowered him down to the hard pan. We've sung Shall We Gather At? The ministers read a few verses and everyone's holding their hat. Well, the preacher asked me quite kindly to say a few words at his death. So I mumble and say, he was steady. And then I stop and catch my breath. But I'm too choked up to continue. The crowd thinks I've been overcame, but they haven't delivered his tombstone and I can't remember his name. That is a tribute to the late, great Baxter Black. He told me his great-grandmother grew up here in Sedalia. Picture in the middle is I am on the left in my Boss of the Plains hat, which is the first hat that Stetson made. I haven't figured out what I'm the boss of, but I may one of these days, but I still wear the hat once in a while. On the right is Dusty Rogers, who's the son of Dale Evans and Roy Rogers. Roy Rogers was one of the originators of the Sons of the Pioneers. His son Dusty is now the lead singer and the leader of the Sons of the Pioneers. They were here as a fundraiser for Trails End, and they came back to play with our symphony orchestra. So the Sons of the Pioneers are still tumbling along like a tumbling tumbleweed. Back to our virtual tour of the train, we talked a little bit about the locomotive. And like I said, the 440 was a pretty standard locomotive back in the time. The cow catcher on the front, the light, the funnel stack for burning the wood. And this is the Lincoln funeral train, also a 440. The Lincoln funeral train in 1865 went from Washington about 1,600 miles going through 400 towns on its way to Springfield, Illinois. The tender, the car behind it, was made out of original Missouri Pacific parts made out in Kansas. Carried the woods, usually some extra water, some tools. You'll see toolboxes up on the front. The cattle car would hold about 16 steers. And it came from the Denver Rio Grande line. That's how it looked when it arrived here. And you can see it took a fair amount of work to get it converted. The only original wood left is the very bottom wood. The rest of it was pretty rotten. So it had to be rebuilt using the same hardware back to its original configuration. Now, the colors of these cars were what they were originally painted back in that time. But the yellow probably didn't stay that long hauling cattle around. So the Trails End Committee had to rebuild all of these, retrofit them back to the 1860s before they made their way out to the Starline Brass Trails End Plaza. The statues are bronze statues, and a letter went out to all the sculptors west of the Mississippi. The winning sculptor was J. Michael Wilson, and he worked with Adonis Foundry also in Salt Lake. And I think their big advantage was they worked together. It wasn't, well, here is a sculptor you have to deal with, here is a foundry you have to deal with. They worked closely together, and they won the bid to do the sculpting, which was about a 2-year process. And the process is the lost wax process of bronzing. Bronzing in this lost wax model goes back about 1400 or 4500 years to the Bronze Age. And so it started with a sketch, and it went back and forth from the committee back to the artist till everybody was pretty happy with the product. Then he made the maquettes, or the tabletop levels, you can see on the bottom left. Then it goes to a CAT scanner. The CAT scanner carves out giant blocks of styrofoam, and then the clay is put on that. Toward the right, you'll see J. Michael Wilson. You can get an idea about the size of it, working on the Trail Boss. He puts the clay on. The next portion of it is it has to be broken down, because you can only bronze a piece about 1.5 by 1.5 feet. So the Trail Boss on its horse would be probably 140 different pieces that have to be bronzed, welded back together, and polished down to get to the final. As we talk about the drover's caboose, as far as I know, there's only a few drover's cabooses left. And you'll see on the upper left, there's a big door. So when they'd come to a stop, they'd unload the horses, move the cattle out of the cattle cars, feed and water them, move them back into the cattle cars. The horses would go back up into the drover's caboose. On the upper right, we are looking down the train track, and you'll see there are different widths. At the time of the Civil War, there were 23 different gauges. That's 23 widths of track. It wasn't until about 1885 that they said, well, this is silly. We need to standardize the track, which is now 4'8" and 1/2 inch. So the only standard rail is the caboose. All the others are different gauges of train. I'd like to say we planned it that way, but these old cars are hard to find. Those are the ones we could find. But I like to say it's the educational piece showing the different gauges of tracks that we had back then. If you look at the windmill was an essential part of the Western expansion. And this is an Aero motor 10-foot out of Chicago. But the standard European windmills were too big, too bulky to do much good. But it wasn't until Daniel Halliday, 1854, came up with the American windmill, which revolutionized the West. Before, you had to move west, you had to be by a spring, be by a river to have water for yourself and your livestock and your family. Now trains could go anywhere they wanted to get water for the steam engines. Cattle and ranches could be, livestock could be most anywhere if you had your windmill. At one point, over 300 companies were making 1 million windmills a year as the move west continued. Then about 1935, the REA, the Rural Electrification Act, came along. Electricity came along with gasoline engines, and there are still some in use, but primarily it became a symbol of the Old West to have the windmill. But 100 years goes by, and it's amazing what happens with history. Back come the turbine windmills, back to their glory. On the back of the donor wall is information. There's about 60 million people that are very hard of hearing, and so our guide by sail isn't going to do them much good. So most of the information on there is also written on these forums along with pictures of the West for information. In the middle is a kind of a bird's eye view of the Western expansion. And I did find a German cartographer who put together the map on a National Geographic map. Get a little closer look up of that here in a minute. But as we were looking at talking about the Western expansion, there was a thing called manifest destiny. In the 19th century, it was thought that America should be one country and everything from the Atlantic to the Pacific should all be one great country as people were moving west. And of course, the Native Americans, it didn't work out quite so well for them, but it was the theory of the day. Before the trains were going, it was steamboats that led the way for the American West, primarily on the Ohio River, Missouri, and the Mississippi River. One time early in the 1800s, there could be over 1,000 riverboats a day that were out on the rivers. And so they could go in a few feet of water. A wagon could go about 7 miles a day. A steamboat could go upriver against the current 100 miles a day. So it was fairly revolutionary in the time. Of course, it was also hazardous. Over 3,200 either exploded or burned or sank, being hit by logs as they went through shallow waters. Now in St. Louis, they have an arch that says Missouri is the gateway to the West. And Sam Clemens cut his teeth as a riverboat captain up by Hannibal, and his name, Mark Twain, actually is a river term that means 2 fathoms or 12 feet of water, is the Mark Twain. And of course, the steam engine revolutionized the Industrial Revolution itself. In the early 1800s, the steamboat. And it wasn't until about 1830 that steam locomotives made in America came to be. First one was the Tom Thumb in about 1830 by the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. And of course, the rivers, it was pretty limited where you could go, where with the trains, you can go over all the rest of America. And by 1880, there were over 200,000 miles of tracks going across the United States. And that confirms with cattle trails as well. As the trains moved on, there were new railheads. You didn't have to travel as far to get your cattle to the rail. And eventually, the rail made it all the way into Texas. Well, after the Civil War, the train moved on, and the Missouri Pacific and the MKT, Missouri, Kansas, Texas lines had their repair shops here in Sedalia. More trains were repaired here than most any place west of the Mississippi for a time. So we had the historic Katy Depot, we had the shops repairing all of these. And because of that, UP ended up calling Sedalia, Missouri, one of the Train Town USA centers. This is the kind of the satellite view of the Western expansion of things going through Missouri. As people moved west, they pushed the Indians west, so the Trail of Tears came through Missouri on the way to Oklahoma. If you wanted to get west fast, you could go on the Butterfield stagecoach. In Missouri, you could ride about 2,700 miles in 25 days to get to California. If you were going to do it by wagon train, that would be about a 4 to 6 month run. There were about 150 different stagecoaches on the Butterfield line, and they carried the mail at the time as well as passengers. Moving west, you could come through Sedalia and take your wagon, join a wagon train in Independence. From Independence, you could go on the California Trail, Oregon Trail, or Santa Fe Trail. If you wanted to ride the Pony Express, you could go up to St. Joe, Missouri, and you could ride on there. They went 2,000 miles in about 10 days, at about 190 different stops, and that ran for about 2 years only. And so a lot of the activity, the first trail drive coming up, the Trail of Tears, stagecoach route, Lewis and Clark, all moving west, came through Missouri. So maybe we are the gateway to the West. Most people look at GPS now. They don't look at maps, but I think you can learn a lot of things from the maps. From this one, it has the silver mines, the gold mines, the first national park, which President Grant did in 1872, shoot out the OK Corral. So it gives you kind of a feeling the overall extension of the West. And one thing that many people didn't realize, there was a trade route that went for 300 years from Mexico up to Santa Fe and called the El Camino Real Trail. And back at the time, cars weren't around and the roads were pretty awful, but you had all these train routes going everywhere. And so the bicycle industry was picking up speed, so people would make rail cars to go from town to town. It was pretty smooth. There wasn't a lot of grade that they had to go on. They could throw it off the track anytime a train came along. And so there were over 10,000 of these rail cycles, and they're pretty hard to come by. This particular one was donated by James Allen, the owner of the Peddler's Bicycle Museum in Springfield, one of the finest bicycle museums in the country. Another common sight was the hand car. There was a track crew of about 4 to 6 men that would take care of about 10 miles of track. So they'd load up here, take their equipment, go back and forth, maintaining their 10 miles of track. Again, there were thousands of these. Very few were left. In fact, I found this one took about 5 years in a warehouse up in Chicago. And it still runs. I ran it up and down the track a bit, and it's pretty hard work. One of our last additions was the Indian Scout, donated by the Hayden Freedom Foundation. The same Haydens and the same Starline brass that were the main benefactors for the trails in Plaza. And Missouri had Missouri tribes, Osage, Illini, Sac, Fox, Shawnee, Oto, Chickasaw, and Iowa through parts of Missouri's history. And Indian Scouts have been used since the 1600s. They knew the flora, the fauna, they knew the waterways, they knew the passes, they knew the hiding places, they knew the friendly tribes, they knew the unfriendly tribes, and they were important in our military history as well. And so this was commissioned by J. Michael Wilson, the same sculptor who did the other statues, and Adonis Foundry out in Salt Lake City. And right now, there's about 2 or 3% of the population has Indian bloodlines. That's about 10 million. And right now, the Indians are on about 2% of the land that once they called their own. Now, having a trailhead like that, having a plaza, made it open to do a lot of fun things. So in 2019, the International Meet for High Wheel Bicycles was here. So we had 165 people from around the world with high wheel bikes, antique bikes, and we took our annual picture down at Trails End. When the eclipse came, we had a little party for several hundred of our best friends. I had a trail ride and a bunch of activities also down on the Trails End Plaza. About 10 years ago, I started the Missouri State Cow Chip Throwing Contest. And as many of you know, cow chips were essential in the West. There weren't any trees out here, and so the families would go out, collect cow chips. They would burn them. They burned pretty clean, and they used them for branding, for heating, for cooking. They were a central part of survival for the earliest settlers. And so in recapping that piece of history, we now have cow chip throwing contests that we do 2 or 3 times a year, along with the state championship. Now, our current record is 154 feet, which is a pretty good toss, but we let the chips fall where they may. Some good advice is you got to keep your mouth closed when you're throwing. You may lick your fingers before or after you throw. We advise not picking a cow pie that looks like a boomerang. And all of our cow chips have flying experience at least 3 feet. And our philosophy is that in their hearts, a cow chip is much like a snowflake. No two are alike. We have a lot of Hispanic folks now, as many communities do. And so we had a day, all the tours were done in Spanish for that afternoon. And there is an internationally renowned sculptor in Missouri by the name of Clay Gant, who does wildlife and equine statues. And the story goes that a cavalryman got back to Texas with nothing but his horse and his Bible. And there was the little job to be had. And so he got on the first trail drive in 1866, heading to Sedalia. Turns out he and his horse survived the treacherous pathway. And when the sights of Sedalia came into view, it was thought that a prayer was in order. God, I humbly give thanks for this successful cattle drive and for my steady partner who hung with me day and night over the months and miles of rough trails. I'm grateful for you seeing us through and for my trusted companion as we have had each other's back more times than I care to remember. I've come to admire and respect this two-legged creature of yours and ask you to watch over us as we ride the West together. Amen. Some people say, well, Kiburz, that didn't make any sense. Well, you have to realize it is the horse that's saying the prayer. Well, you've had a virtual tour of the fairgrounds and the Trails End Plaza. So it's my opportunity to tell you about an opportunity to see it in person. A 3-day music and activity festival, September 20th through the 22nd. Tours of Trails End. The traveling Vietnam Wall will be here. It is the 50th anniversary of the end of the Vietnam Wall. It is the 75th anniversary of the VW Bug coming to America. So we'll have 3 different car shows. One of them is for the VWs. There'll be poker runs. There'll be quilt shows, art shows, vendors, food trucks, kids zones. Parking is free. Entrance to all the activity is also free, except to get in the grandstand, where there'll be 2 nights of 60s, 70s, and 80s rock and roll. As I look at some of these pictures here, I think some of you may meet that demographic. And you can't have a festival in Missouri without having some country. And so we have a modern country lineup for Saturday night. But we expect that it's going to be a pretty good time, and we invite anybody to come. It's the biggest campground in the state of Missouri with all the hookups. You can bring your tent, bring your RV, and come and join us for the weekend. So I do appreciate your time and attention coming from Maple Leaf Meadows Ranch, where the cowgirls are pretty, generations keep rolling. We found there's more than one way to ride high in the saddle. The dogs are friendly. And even though people tell us all the time to take a hike, every once in a while we actually do. So again, thank you for your time. And I'd entertain any questions you might have.
Thank you so much, Doug. Outstanding presentation. Very, very informative. I am putting in the chat the telephone number where a person can call from anywhere and enjoy the audio tour, beginning with Leroy Van Dyke. I've had the chance to do that. You can dial that number from anywhere. There are a bunch of options, as you saw in the slides, to learn about all different aspects of Sedalia. And I'm impressed that you've trained the horse and the dog to tell those stories. Let me see if there are any questions in the chat, or if anyone cares to unmute and ask a question.
I have a question.
Go ahead.
What were the years of the trail, beginning and end?
1866 is when they started, so I guess it would have been that year for the first trail drive coming to Sedalia. And right after that, of course, the train moved on as the war ended. So it would have moved west pretty quickly. But then a lot of the trains were still going north, so people had the cattle loaded on trains coming to Sedalia to stop and refresh the animals as they head north and west, north and east.
Doug, this is Lonnie. Weren't there skirmishes between the homesteaders and the cattle drives?
Yeah, there were. It was the Texas fever that they were worried about. It's a parasite that the longhorns, it didn't bother them, but it would decimate a lot of the herds up here. So there were armed people trying to keep the cattle drovers off and keep them out, but some of them did make it through.
Kansas Jayhawkers and the Missouri Bushwhackers they were all involved in these conflicts, I think.
Yeah, there was renegades, there was Indians, there was cattle rustlers. It was a pretty rigorous run to get a cattle drive through. Tom. Oh, sorry.
If you are interested in windmills, the definitive book is by Lindsay Baker, A Field Guide to American Windmills, and it is an absolutely fascinating book. And your Halliday stuff is in there too.
Thank you very much. Actually, we have 2 windmills on our 40-acre manure spread. And so I do love windmills. I mean, who doesn't?
And Dr. Baker is actually a member of our Fort Worth Westerners Club.
Thank you very much for that.
Yeah, this is
Wow.
Steve in Fort Worth. What kind of stories do you have about Sedalia like they have about Abilene and Dodge City with the cowboys and the marshals and the sheriffs?
You know, it was a rough town, but no different than most Western towns. You know, we had 100 houses of ill repute. There were shootings, hangings. It was pretty lawless for a time. And so I don't know of any specifics, but in talking to some of the older folks that their grandparents told them about, it was pretty rough going in the early days with all the railroaders and the cowboys rolling through.
I noticed on your maps that most of the time you mark the Western Trail as starting probably at Bandera, Texas, just northwest of San Antonio, and going only to Allegola, Nebraska as the end of it. My great grandfather and his 3 brothers rode the Sedalia Trail once. They rode what's known as the Chisholm 3 times to Kansas, and they rode the Great Western all the way to Canada 3 times.
Wow.
And so many of the maps do not show that the Great Western went from actually from Matamoros, Mexico, all the way into 2 provinces in Canada. And more cattle went up the trail, more horses to stock the pastures of the grassland where the buffalo had been cleared, and they were starting ranches. And I have 2nd and 3rd cousins, although I grew up on Charles Goodnight's 4th ranch in the Panhandle of Texas, at Kittiquay in the canyons, but I have 2nd and 3rd cousins who live in North Dakota, Wyoming, and Montana, because my great uncles went up there and saw that grassland driving herds of cattle up there, and then their kids went back up there and bought ranches. So my family has been ranching. I'm 7th generation Texan. They came into Nacogdoches south of Nacogdoches in 1821 before the Austin colony. They rounded up wild longhorns and drove them back to New Orleans and put them on ships, and they went around Florida up to the East Coast in 1821 all the way through the early 1830s. And so, you know, South Texas cattle have gone all the way up to the East Coast on boats, on ships, as well as the rail. And then the Matador Ranch out near where I grew up owned a ranch up in Canada. And at the West Texas Historical Association a couple of months ago, we had a presentation. The Matador was owned by a company in Scotland, and they actually shipped cattle from up in Western Canada all the way across Canada by rail, put them on ships, and then slaughtered them in Scotland because they didn't have ice, and so they couldn't take them across the ocean. But there were not enough, apparently, during those times, enough beef cattle in Scotland, and so people had developed a taste for beef rather than pork.
That is an amazing piece of history. I'd be damn proud of that heritage.
Yes,
That is rich history, Bob. I'm so glad you shared that. And we're actually working with Michael Grauer on an article about the cattle trails, and he made it a point to show me that the trails actually did begin in northern Mexico and reached
right
up into Canada. So much further than some of our contemporary history recognizes.
Yeah, we've actually marked. I'm the new president of the West Texas Trails. I'm also
Great
president of West Texas Trails Association, but of the Great Western Cattle Trail, 9 states, and we have put markers in all the way from Matamoros, Mexico into Canada. 2 summers ago, we finished putting the markers in the southern part of North Dakota. The idea was to put a marker every 6 miles if it was public property. And if it's private property, we asked the landowner to at least let us put 1 marker on their land. And we haven't quite finished it, but it's been a huge task. But we do now have most of the trail marked.
I'm sure
Folks,
somebody there will know, what was Lonesome Dove? What trail was that on?
Well, Lonesome Dove basically was on the actually the film itself depicts that it wasn't even on a trail, but it was primarily it's a Goodnight Loving Trail, and the Goodnight Loving Trail starts just north of Mineral Wells. My great grandmother's family were southern neighbors to Charles Goodnight and Oliver Loving. That was Goodnight's first ranch. And that's in Keachai Valley, which today is Possum Kingdom Lake. And they drove the cattle from there southwest to the Pecos. And the only place they could cross the Pecos River was at Horsehead Crossing. And I now have the privilege of being the producer of the Horsehead Crossing celebration every year, the end of October, out in the middle of nowhere. The private ranch owner is to let us do it now for 5 years. And we have the archaeology study of it. We know where the cattle trail went. It was also the crossing for it was first an Indian trail. I worked with the Comanche and the Kiowa nations, and we had the Comanches down this past year, but they crossed there for virtually 200 years. On their way to Mexico, it was the second of the what's called the Comanche Plunder Trail or the Comanche War Trail, and but then also it's the crossing for the Butterfield Overland Stage. It was the Marcy Crossing or the California Trail going to California with the Gold Rush. Within 4 years, over 200,000 people went through that crossing, and the stagecoaches, they had to take them across on barges most of the time. And but the cattle crossed at a little different spot just to the north of there, because they didn't have enough cowboys to put cowboys on the east side and or send some ahead. And so when they got the cattle across, they would cross them across that river into a natural bend. So it was kind of like a corral, and you didn't have to have but a few cowboys kind of at the end of it. But so many of them drowned in that river. It's salty, it's alkaline, and it's over 50 miles on the east side with no water until you get there. And what happens is, the reason it's called Horsehead Crossing, cattle cross the rivers differently than horses. Cattle, when they go into the river, will swim and not jump on top of one another. But horses, when they smell water and they're thirsty, they will jump in on top of one another. So a lot of horses were killed. And when the first surveyor came in there, he was surveying it, and he noticed all these horse skulls along the river bank. And that's because when the Indians would come by, and even when the trail drives would come by and the horses would die in the river, they didn't take them out of the river. They just left them in the river. And of course, later on, they would take the horse skulls and put them up on the side of the bank. So it's called Horsehead Crossing because of all those horse skulls up there. So,
folks, if you find this as interesting as we do, you'll want to stay tuned for future Cattle Trails showcase sessions, and you'll want to join us. And you'll want to join us in Dodge City, Kansas.
I'm planning on doing that.
And
I'm planning on doing that. We're working now with the Butterfield, which was just named a historic trail back in January, and then also with the Goodnight Loving Trail. as well as the Great Western and the Chisholm. And also El Camino Real, which goes east to west in Texas, and then El Camino Real, the other trail, the Royal Road, goes north and south in New Mexico. So we're working with all of those groups, and then also the Marcy Trail, which is sometimes called the Southern California Trail.
Ron,
wow.
Lonnie, hey, I think maybe we've identified our November program. If Bob will oblige us, we'll try to get that set up.
Which one you want? You want one on the Comanches, or you want one on the Cowboys, or the?
We'll take a poll and find out.
There you go.
I'd like to request, there's some names on here that I don't recognize. If you're not getting emails from me about these Cattle Trails Showcase, please send me an email. It's girlofks@gmail.com. And I can get you on the list, because some of these names I don't recognize.
Spell that first name, first part of it.
It's Girl of Kansas, GIRL,
Oh, okay.
sorry, of KS@gmail.com.
Got it.
Ron, you might explain that really part of what we're trying to do is to expand and kind of create a consortium of cattle trails with this program.
Yes, I am posting Nancy's email address in the chat, and we encourage you to please send her a note and sign up, and so you're on our list for future sessions.
And tell me who you are and what group you're with, so I can kind of keep that separate too. Thank you.
And we invite you to come in person to Dodge City on November 1st and 2nd for the Western and Chisholm Trail Conference in Dodge. Bob will be there, and others who are on this call will be there. So join us in person for that event. We are talking about a Cattle Trails Consortium, because our group has started with the Chisholm Trail. We've come to recognize there's great value in the multiple historic cattle trails. And we all would benefit from working together. And so we hope to reach out and expand our circle, as Bob is doing, to reach out and involve and engage more people who are interested in promoting the history of the historic trails.
Ron, would you, on Nancy, kind of introduce what she does in Wichita and her association with the old town there?
Oh, okay. I'm the secretary of the International Chisholm Trail Association. I'm also on the board of trustees with Old Cowtown Museum, and have been for about 4 years now. And I'm also on the Greenway Alliance. I wear a lot of hats. Can't talk today for some reason, but which is rare. But yeah, we're at Old Cowtown Museum. I'm just on the board.
And
And
what
it sounds like you're a good secretary also.
I try. I try.
He is. And in the course of doing this program, we've learned about some fantastic places: Old Cowtown and Wichita, now the Trails End Plaza, and so many more attractions along the historic trails north and south. It's been a delight. I think we're at our time boundary, folks. So thank you for joining us. We will be posting this on YouTube. Again, mark your calendars for November 1st and 2nd for the Cattle Trail Conference in Dodge City, Kansas. And so to close our program, this is Ron Wilson, Poet Laureate, saying thanks for taking time to join us in this place, and come on back next month for our Cattle Trails Showcase. Happy trails, everyone.
Thank you, Ron.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Doug.
Thank you, Doug. Thank you, everybody.
Nancy,
Yes.
do you have the Crazingers' email address?